Chapter 4. The Public Life of Jesus, Popular and Esoteric Instruction, Miracles, Apostles, Women. Hitherto I have endeavored to illuminate with its own light that portion of the life of Jesus which the Gospels have left in comparative obscurity, or wrapped around with the veil of legend. I have related by what kind of initiation and development of soul and thought the great Nazarene attained to the messianic consciousness. In a word, I have endeavored to reconstruct the inner genesis of the Christ. The rest of my ask will be all the easier if this genesis be once acknowledged. The public life of Jesus has been related in the Gospels. These narratives contain divergences and contradictions as well as additions. The legend which overlies or exaggerates certain mysteries may still be traced here and there, but from the whole there is set free such a unity of thought and action, so powerful and original a character, that we invincibly feel ourselves in the presence of reality and of life. These inimitable stories cannot be reconstructed. Their childlike simplicity and symbolical beauty tell us more than any amplifications can do. But what is needed nowadays is the illumination of the role of Jesus by esoteric traditions and truths showing the signification and bearing of his double teaching. What were these good tidings of which was the bearer? This already famous Essene, who had now returned from the shores of the Dead Sea to his native Galilee to preach the gospel of the kingdom? How was he to change the face of the world? The thoughts of the prophets had just found their realization to him. Strong in the entire gift of his very being, he now came to share with men this kingdom of heaven which he had won in meditation and strife, in torments of pain and boundless joy. He came to rend asunder the veil which the ancient religion of Moses had cast over the future beyond the tomb. He came to say, "Believe, love, act, and let hope be the soul of your deeds. Beyond this earth there is a world of souls, a more perfect life. This I know, for I come therefrom. Thither I will lead you. But mere aspiration for that world will not suffice. To attain it, you must begin by realizing it here below, first in yourselves, afterwards in humanity. By what means? By love and active charity." So the young prophet came to Galilee. He did not say he was the Messiah, but discussed in the synagogues concerning the laws and the prophets. He preached on the banks of the lake of Gennesareth, in fishermen's boats, by the fountains, in the oases of verdure abounding between Capernaum, Bethsaida, and Chorazin. He healed the sick by laying on of hands, a mere look command, often by his presence alone. Multitudes followed him, and already numerous disciples attached themselves to him. These he recruited from among the fishermen, tax collectors, from the common people, in a word. Those of upright, unsullied nature, possessed of an ardent faith, were the ones he wanted, and these he irresistibly attracted to himself. He was guided in his choice by that gift of second sight, which has ever been the peculiarity of men of action, but especially of religious initiators. A single look enabled him to fathom the depths of a soul. He needed no other test, and when he said, "Follow me," he was obeyed. A single gesture summoned to his side the timid and hesitating, to whom he said, "Come unto me, ye that are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and ye shall find rest unto your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." He divined the innate thoughts of men who, in trouble and confusion, recognized the Master. At times, he recognized in unbelief uprightness of heart. When Nathanael said, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Jesus replied, "Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom is no guile." From his adepts, he required neither oaths nor profession of faith, simply love and belief in himself. He put into practice the common possession of goods as a principle of fraternity among his own. Jesus thus began to realize within his small group of followers the kingdom of heaven he wished to establish on earth. The Sermon on the Mount offers us an image of this kingdom already formed in germ, along with a resume of the popular teachings of Jesus. He is seated upon the top of the hill. The future initiates are grouped at his feet. Farther down the slope, the eager crowd drinks in the words which fall from his mouth. What is the doctrine of the new teacher? Fasting or maceration or public penance? No, he says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted." Then he unrolls in ascending order the 4 final beatitudes, the marvelous power of humility, of sorrow for others, of the inner goodness of the heart, and of hunger and thirst after righteousness. Then in glowing colors he depicts the active and triumphant virtues, compassion, purity of heart, militant kindness, and finally, martyrdom for righteousness' sake. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Like the sound of a golden bell, this promise gives his listeners a faint glimpse of the starry heavens above the Master's head. They see the humble virtues, no longer in the guise of poor, emaciated women in gray penitents' robes, but transformed into beatitudes, into virgins of light, whose brightness effaces the splendor of the lilies and the glory of Solomon. With the gentle breath of their palm leaves, they scatter over these thirsting souls the fragrant perfumes of the heavenly kingdom. The wonder is that this kingdom expands, not in the distant heavens, but in the hearts of the listeners. They exchange looks of astonishment with one another. These poor in spirit have, of a sudden, become so rich. Mightier than Moses, the soul's magician has struck their hearts, from which rushes up an immortal spring of life. His teaching to the people may be summed up in a sentence: the kingdom of heaven is within you. Now that he lays before them the means necessary to attain to this unheard of happiness, they are no longer astonished at the extraordinary things he asks of them. To kill even the desire for evil, to forgive offenses, to love their enemies. So powerful is the stream of love with which his heart overflows that he carries them away along the current. In his presence they find everything easy. Mighty the novelty, singular the boldness of such teaching. The Galilean prophet sets the inner life of the souls above all outer practices, the invisible above the visible, the kingdom of heaven above the benefits of earth. He commands that the choice be made between God and man. Then, summoning up his doctrine, he says, "Love your neighbor as yourself. Be ye perfect, even as your Father, which is in heaven, is perfect." Thus, in popular form, he afforded a glimpse of the whole profundity of science and morals. For the supreme commandment of the initiation is to reproduce divine perfection in the perfecting of the soul, and the secret of science lies in the chain of analogy and correspondences, united in ever-enlarging circles, the particular to the universal, the finite to the infinite. If such was the public and purely moral teaching of Jesus, it is evident that in addition he gave private instruction to his disciples, parallel with and explanatory of the former, showing its inner meaning and penetrating to the very depths of the spiritual truth he held of the Esoteric traditions of the Essenes and of his own existence. As this tradition was violently crushed by the Church from the 2nd century onwards, the major of the theologians no longer knew the real bearing of Christ's words, with their sometimes double and triple meanings, and saw none but the primary and literal signification. For those who deeply studied the doctrine of the mysteries in India, Egypt, and Greece, the esoteric thought of the Christ animates not merely his slightest word, but every act of his life. Dimly perceptible in the 3 synoptics, it springs into complete evidence in the Gospel of John. Here may be stated an instance touching an essential point of the doctrine. Jesus happens to be passing by Jerusalem. He is not yet preaching in the temple, though he heals the sick and gives instruction to his friends. The work of love must prepare to the ground in which the fruit seed shall fall. Nicodemus, a learned Pharisee, has heard of the new prophet. Filled with curiosity, though unwilling to compromise himself in the eyes of his sect, he requests with the Galilean a secret interview, which is granted. The Pharisee calls at his dwelling by night and says to him, Rabbi, I know that thou art a teacher come from God, for no man can do these miracles that thou doest, except God be with him. Jesus replied, Verily, verily, I say unto thee, except a man be born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. Nicodemus asks if it is possible for a man to enter a second time into his mother's womb and be born. Jesus answered, Verily I say unto thee, except a man be born of water and of spirit, he cannot enter into the kingdom of God. Under this evidently symbolical form, Jesus sums up the ancient doctrine of regeneration already known in the mysteries of Egypt. To be born again of water and of spirit, to be baptized by water and fire, mark 2 degrees of initiation, 2 stages of the inner and spiritual development of man. Water here represents truth, perceived intellectually, i.e. in an abstract and general manner. It purifies the soul and develops its spiritual germ. A new birth by the Spirit, or baptism by heavenly fire, signifies the assimilation of truth by the will in such a way that it may become the blood and life, the very soul of every action. From this results the complete victory of spirit over matter, the absolute mastery of the spiritualized soul over the body transformed into a docile instrument. A mastery which awakens its dormant faculties, opens its inner sense, and gives it an intuitive sight into truth and a direct action of soul on soul. This state is equivalent to the heavenly one which Jesus Christ called the kingdom of God. Baptism by water, or intellectual initiation, is accordingly the first step in rebirth. Baptism by the Spirit is total rebirth, a transformation of the soul by fire of intelligence and will, and consequently, to a certain extent, of the elements of the body, in a word, a radical regeneration. From this come the exceptional powers it gives to man. This is the earthly signification of the eminently theosophical conversation between Nicodemus and Jesus. There is also a special signification which might briefly be called the esoteric doctrine concerning the constitution of man. According to this doctrine, man is threefold: body, soul, and spirit. He has an immortal and indivisible part, the spirit, a perishable and divisible part, the body. The soul, which unites the two, shares in the nature of both. Living organism, as it is, it possesses an ethereal and fluidic body similar to the material body, which, but for this indivisible double, would have neither life, movement, nor unity. According as man obeys the suggestions of the spirit or impulses of the body, according as he attaches himself to the one or the other, the fluidic body becomes etherealized or dulled, unifies, or becomes disaggregated. Accordingly, it happens that after physical death, the majority of men have to submit to a second death of the soul, which consists of cleansing itself from the impure elements of their astral body, sometimes even undergoing its slow decomposition. While the completely regenerated man, having formed on this earth his spiritual body, possesses his heaven in himself and enters the region to which his affinity attracts him. Now water, in ancient esotericism, symbolizes fluidic matter which is infinitely transformable, as fire symbolizes the one spirit. In speaking of rebirth by water and spirit, the Christ makes allusion to that double transformation of his spiritual body, his fluidic envelope which awaits man after death, and without which he cannot enter the kingdom of lofty souls and purified spirits. For that which is born of the flesh is flesh, i.e., chained down and perishable, and that which is born of the Spirit is spirit, i.e., free and immortal. Marvel not that I say unto thee, Ye must be born again. The wind bloweth where it listeth, and thou hearest the sound thereof, but cannot tell whence it cometh and whither it goeth. So is every one that is born of the Spirit. Thus spoke Jesus to Nicodemus in the silence of the night at Jerusalem. A small lamp, placed between the two, dimly lights their vague, uncertain forms. But the eyes of the Galilean master shine with mysterious brilliancy through the darkness, how could one help believing the soul when looking into those eyes, now gently beaming, now flashing forth the glory of heaven? The learned Pharisee has seen his knowledge of Scripture texts crumble away, but then he obtains a glimpse of a new world. He has seen a divine light in the face of the prophet, whose long auburn hair is falling over his shoulders. He has felt the powerful warmth emanating from his being draw him to the Master. He has seen small white flames like a magnetic halo appear and disappear around his brow and temples. And then he imagined he felt the breath of the Spirit pass over his heart. Moved to his inmost soul, Nicodemus returned secretly in the silence of the night to his home. He will continue to live among the Pharisees, but in the secrecy of his heart, he will remain faithful to Jesus. Let us note one more important point in this teaching. According to the materialistic doctrine, the soul is an ephemeral and accidental resultant of the forces of the body. In the ordinary spiritualist doctrine, it is something abstract, without any conceivable bond with the body. In the Esoteric doctrine, the only rational one, the physical body is a product of the incessant work of the soul, which acts upon it by the similar organism of the astral body, just as the visible universe is only a dynamism of the infinite spirit. This is the reason Jesus gives this doctrine to Nicodemus as explanation of the miracles he works. It may indeed serve as a key to the occult healing art practiced by him and by a small number of adepts and saints before as well as after Christ. Ordinary medicine combats the evils of the body by acting on the latter. The adept or saint, being a center of spiritual and fluidic force, acts directly on the soul of the patient and by his astral on his physical body. It is the same in all magnetic cures. Jesus operates by means of forces existing in all men, but he operates in large doses by powerful and concentrated projections. He gives the scribes and Pharisees his power of healing bodies as a proof of his power to pardon and heal the soul, his higher object. The physical cure thus becomes the counterproof of a moral cure, which permits of his saying to the man made whole, "Rise and walk." Science of today tries to explain the phenomenon which the ancients and Middle Ages called possession as being a simple nervous disorder. The explanation is insufficient. Psychologists who attempt to penetrate more deeply into the mystery of the soul see therein a duplication of consciousness and eruption of its latent part. This question touches that of the different planes of the human consciousness, which acts now on the one, now on the other, the changing play being studied in different somnambulistic conditions. It also touches the sensitive world. In any case, it is certain Jesus had the faculty of restoring equilibrium in troubled bodies and restoring souls to their purest consciousness. Veritable magic, said Plotinus, is love, with hate its contrary. It is by love and hate that magicians act, through their philters and enchantments. Love in its highest consciousness and supreme power constituted the magic of the Christ. Numerous disciples took part in his inner teaching. Still, in order to give lasting power to the new religion, there was needed an active group of chosen ones who should become the pillars of the spiritual temple he wished to erect over against the other, hence the institution of the apostles. These he did not choose from among the Essenes, as he needed men whose natures were vigorous and fresh to implant his religion in the very heart of the people. Two groups of brothers, Simon, Peter, and Andrew, the sons of Jonas, on the one hand, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, on the other, all four fishermen by occupation and belonging to the respectable families, formed the first apostles. At the beginning of his career, Jesus appears to them at Capernaum, by the lake of Gennesareth, where they were engaged in their daily occupation. He takes up his abode with them and converts the whole family. Peter and John stand out as prominent figures among the 12. Peter, straightforward and narrow-minded, easily influenced by either hope or discouragement, but at the same time a man of action, capable by reason of his energetic character and absolute faith of leading the others. John, of a deep hidden nature, enthusiastic to such a degree that Jesus called him the Son of Thunder. His ardent soul always concentrated on itself, by disposition melancholy, and given to reverie, though subject to formidable outbursts and apocalyptic visions. His tenderness of soul, spite all of this, was such as the rest never suspected, and only the Master knew. John alone, silent and contemplative, will understand the inmost thought of the Christ. He will be the evangelist of love and divine intelligence, the esoteric apostle par excellence. Persuaded by his words, convinced by his acts, dominated by his mighty intelligence, and encircled in his magnetic radiance, the apostles followed the Master from town to town, preaching to the populace, alternated with secret instruction as he gradually opened out to them his thoughts. All the same, he still maintained profound silence concerning himself, his own future. He had told them that the kingdom of heaven was at hand, that the Messiah would soon come. The apostles were already whispering to one another, "It is he," and repeating it to the others. But Jesus, with gentle dignity, simply called himself the Son of Man, an expression of the exoteric signification of which they did not yet understand, though in his mouth it seemed to mean messenger of suffering humanity. For he added, "The foxes have their holes, but the Son of Man hath not where to lay his head." It was only in accordance with the popular Jewish idea that the apostles had hitherto considered the Messiah. Their simple hopes conceived of the kingdom of heaven as being a political government of which Jesus would be the crowned king and they ministers. To combat this idea and radically transform it, revealing to the apostles the true Messiah, the spiritual royalty. To communicate to them this sublime truth, he called the Father the supreme force. He called the Spirit, mysteriously uniting all souls with the invisible, to show them by his word, life and death, a true Son of God, to leave them the conviction that they and all men were his brothers and could rejoin him if they wished, and finally to leave them only after opening to their longing eyes the whole immensity of heaven. This was the mighty work Jesus had commenced on his apostles. Will they believe or not, is the question of the drama being played between them and himself. Another question, far more poignant and terrible, is being asked in the depths of his own consciousness. To this we shall soon give our attention. For at this hour a wave of joy overwhelmed the tragic thought in the consciousness of the Christ. The tempest has not yet burst over the lake of Tiberias. It is the Galilean springtime of the gospel, the dawn of the kingdom of God, the mystic union of the initiate with his spiritual family, which follows and travels with him as the procession of paranymphs follows the bridegroom in the parable. The believing crowd hurries along the footsteps of the beloved Master on the banks of the azure lake enclosed in the glorious hills as in a golden bowl. They go from the fragrant banks of Capernaum to Bethsaida's orange groves and the mountain of Chorazin, where the lake of Gennesareth is bordered by shady palms. In this procession, the women have a place apart. The Master is everywhere surrounded by the mothers or sisters of his disciples, by timid virgins or repentant Magdalenes. Attentive and faithful, impelled by passionate love, they scatter along his path eternal blossoms of sadness and hope. They, at any rate, need no proof that he is the Messiah. A single look into his face is sufficient for them. The wonderful felicity emanating from his aura, added to the note of divine unexpressed suffering they instinctively feel, persuades them that he is the Son of God. Jesus had early stifled himself the cry of the flesh. During his stay among the Essenes, he had tamed the might of the senses. This had given him an empire over the souls and the divine power of pardon, a true angelic bliss. He says to the sinning woman now, with disheveled hair, kneeling at the Master's feet, over which she pours the precious ointment, "Much shall be forgiven her, for she has loved much." Sublime thought, containing an entire redemption, for the pardon sets free. The Christ is the liberator and restorer of women in spite of St. Paul and the fathers of the Church who, by lowering woman to the role of manservant, have wrongly interpreted the Master's thought. She had been glorified in the Vedic times. Buddha had mistrusted her. The Christ has raised her by restoring her mission of love and divination. The initiate woman represents the soul of humanity. Aisha, as Moses had named it, i.e., the power of intuition, the loving and seeing faculty. The impetuous Mary Magdalene, out of whom, according to the biblical expression, Jesus had driven 7 devils, became the most ardent of his disciples. She it was who first, St. John tells us, saw the divine Master, the spiritual Christ risen from the tomb. Legend has been obstinately bent on seeing in the passionate believing woman the greatest worshipper of Jesus, the heart initiate. The legend has not been mistaken, for her history represents the whole regeneration of woman as desired by the Christ. It was in the farm of Bethany, near Martha and Mary Magdalene, that Jesus loved to rest from the labors of his mission and prepare himself for supreme tests. There he lavished his tenderest words of comfort, and in sweet discourse spoke of the divine mysteries he dared not yet confide to his disciples. At times the sun was setting in the golden horizon of the west, half hidden in the branches of the olive groves. Jesus would become pensive, and a veil would overshadow his illumined countenance. He thought of the difficulties of his work, of the uncertain faith of the apostles, of the hostile powers of the world. The temple, Jerusalem, humanity itself, with its crime and ingratitude, seemed to overwhelm him beneath a living mountain. Would his arms upraised to heaven be strong enough to grind this mountain to powder, or would he himself be crushed beneath its mighty bulk? Then he spoke vaguely of a terrible trial which awaited him, and also of his coming end. Awed by his solemn tones, the women dared not question him. However unchangeable the Master's serenity of soul might be, they understood that it was as though wrapped about with the shroud of an indescribable sadness, separating him from the joys of the earth. They had presentiment of the prophet's destiny. They felt his invincible power of resolution. What was the meaning of those gloomy clouds which arose from the direction of Jerusalem? Wherefore this burning wind of fever and death passing over their hearts as over the blighted hills of Judea with their violet cadaverous hues? One evening a star of mystery, a tear shone in Jesus' eyes. A shudder passed through the frames of the women. Their tears also flowed in silence. They were lamenting over him. He was lamenting over all mankind. Chapter 5. Struggle with the Pharisees, flight to Caesarea, the Transfiguration. This Galilean springtime, during which the dawn of the kingdom of heaven seemed to rise upon the attentive multitudes, lasted 2 years. Now, however, the sky darkened, sinister flashes appeared, forerunners of catastrophe. The storm burst upon the small family at the Galilee lake like one of those tempests which sweep the lake of Gennesareth, and in their wild fury engulf the fishermen's frail barks. Jesus was in no way surprised at the consternation and terror of his disciples. He fully expected it. It was impossible that his preaching and increasing popularity should not stir the religious authorities of the Jews, and just as impossible that the struggle should not be a complete one between these authorities and himself. On the contrary, from this conflict alone could light flash forth. At the time of Jesus, the Pharisees formed a compact body of 6,000 men. Their name, Parishon, means separate or distinguished. Of a lofty and often heroic, though narrow and haughty patriotism, they represented the party of national restoration, their existence dating back from the Maccabees. They acknowledged both an oral and written tradition. They believed in angels, a future life and resurrection, but the glimpses of esotericism which came to them from Persia they buried beneath the darkness of a gross material interpretation. Strict observers of the law, though quite opposed to the spirit of the prophets who placed religion in the love of God and of men, They made piety consist of rites and ceremonies, fasts and public penance. On great occasions they were to be seen in the open streets, their faces covered with soot, praying aloud with contrite mien and ostentatiously disturbing alms. In contradistinction to all this, they lived in luxury, eagerly intriguing after authority and power. Nonetheless, were they chiefs of the Democratic Party, holding the people under their control. The Sadducees, on the other hand, represented the sacerdotal and aristocratic party. They were composed of families whose pretension it was to have exercised priesthood by hereditary right ever since the time of David. Extreme in their conservatism, they rejected oral tradition, accepted nothing but the letter of the law, and denied the existence of the soul and a future life. They ridiculed alike the stormy practices of the Pharisees and their extravagant beliefs. For them, religion consisted entirely in sacerdotal ceremonies. Under the Seleucids, they had deprived the pontificate of power, as they were in complete accord with the pagans and were even imbued with Greek sophistry and refined Epicurism. Under the Maccabees, the Pharisees had been ejected from the pontificate, though under Herod, the Romans, they had apparently regained this position. The Sadducees were stern and hard-hearted as men, and lovers of good cheer as priests, possessed one of faith, that of their own superiority, and one of idea, the determination to maintain the power tradition had handed down to them. In such a religion, what could Jesus find? Jesus, the initiate, inheritor of the prophets, the seer of Engadi, seeking in social order the image of the divine in which justice reigns over life, science over justice, and love and wisdom over all three? In the temple, instead of supreme science and initiation, he found materialistic and agnostic ignorance, playing on religion as on a power-giving instrument. In other words, priestly imposture. In schools and synagogues, instead of the bread of life and the dew from heaven falling upon men's hearts, he saw an interested morality under the veneer of formal worship, i.e., hypocrisy. Far above, enthroned in a nimbus of glory, sat Almighty Caesar, the apotheosis of evil and the deification of matter, the sole god of the then world, only possible master of the Sadducees and Pharisees, whether they wished it so or not. In adopting the idea from Persian esotericism, as did the prophets, was Jesus wrong in naming this reign the dominion of Satan or Manes, i.e., the rule of matter over spirit, in place of which he wished to substitute that of spirit over matter? Like all great reformers, he attacked not men, who as exceptions might be excellent, but doctrines and institutions which mold the majority of mankind. The challenge must be delivered and the war declared against the existing powers. The struggle began in the synagogues of Galilee and continued beneath the porticos of the template at Jerusalem, to which Jesus made lengthened visits, preaching and replying to his opponents. In this, as throughout his whole career, he acted with that mixture of prudence and boldness, meditative reserve and impetuous action, which characterized his wonderfully well-balanced nature. He did not take the offensive against his opponents, but waited and replied to their attack, which never tarried, for, from the very beginning of his ministry, the Pharisees had been jealous of him by reason of his popularity and his healing of the sick. They quickly suspected him to be their most dangerous enemy, accosting him with that mocking urbanity, that cunning malevolence veiled beneath a mask of hypocritical gentleness, in which they were past masters in their role as learned doctors and men of importance and authority. They asked what reasons he had for having dealings with publicans and sinners. Why did his disciples dare to pluck ears of corn on the Sabbath day? Such conduct constituted a grave violation of their regulations. With magnanimous gentleness, Jesus replied in words at once tender and courteous. He tried on them his gospel of love, spoke the love of God, who rejoices more over one repentant sinner than over many just persons. He related to them the parables of the lost sheep and of the prodigal son. In embarrassed astonishment, they held their peace. Uniting again, they returned to the charge, reproaching him for healing the sick on the Sabbath day. "Hypocrites," replied Jesus, a flash of indignation illumining his eyes. "Do not you on the Sabbath day remove the chain from your own oxen's neck and lead them away to the watering trough? May not therefore the daughter of Abraham be delivered this same day from the chains of Satan?" No longer knowing what to reply, the Pharisees accused him of casting out devils in the name of Beelzebub. With quite as much wit as logical acumen, Jesus replied that the devil does not cast himself out, adding that sin against the Son of Man will be forgiven, but not sin against the Holy Ghost, signifying thereby that he attached slight importance to the insults against himself personally, but that a denial of the good and of the true, when once established, constitutes intellectual perversity, the supreme vice and irredeemable evil. This was a declaration of war. He was called blasphemer, agent of Beelzebub, which accusations he answered by the expression, "Hypocrites, generation of vipers." From this time the struggle continually increased in bitterness. Jesus gave evidence of a close, incisive logic. His words lashed like whips and pierced like arrows. He had changed tactics. Instead of defending himself, he attacked and replied to charges by other charges more vigorous still, showing no pity for hypocrisy, the one vice at the root of all others. "Why transgress ye the law of God by reason of your traditions? God commanded, 'Honor thy father and thy mother.' You dispense with honoring parents if, as alternative, money flows into the temple. With your lips you serve Isaiah, but your devotion is devoid of heart." Jesus ever kept perfect control over himself, though the enthusiasm and greatness of the struggle daily increased. The more he was attacked, the more emphatically did he proclaim himself as the Messiah. He began to utter threats against the temple, to foretell the misfortunes that Israel would undergo, to appeal the heathen, and to say that the Lord would send other laborers into his vineyard. Thereupon the Pharisees of Jerusalem became anxious. Seeing they could neither impose silence on him nor find any effective retort, they too changed tactics. Their idea now was to ensnare him, so they sent deputations whose object it was to induce him to utter heretical sayings which would warrant the Sanhedrin in laying hands on him as a blasphemer in the name of the law of Moses, or having him condemned as a rebel by the Roman governor. Hence, the insidious question concerning the woman taken in adultery and the coin stamped with Caesar's image. Ever penetrating the designs of his enemies, Jesus, with profound psychology and skillful strategy, disarmed them by his replies. Finding it impossible to effect their object by these means, the Pharisees attempted to intimidate him by annoying him at every turn. Worked upon and excited by them, the majority of the people began to turn away from Jesus when they saw that he was not restoring the kingdom of Israel. Everywhere, even in the smallest of hamlets, he met suspicious and wily countenances, spies, and treacherous emissaries to track and dishearten him. Some came and said to him, "Depart from here, for Herod is bent on killing thee." He replied proudly, "Go tell that fox, it cannot be that a prophet die out of Jerusalem." Nevertheless, he was often obliged to cross the Sea of Tiberias and take refuge on the eastern bank in order to escape these snares. Nowhere was he now free from danger. Meanwhile, John the Baptist was put to death by order of Antipas in the fortress of Machaerus. It is said that Hannibal, on seeing the head of his brother Hasdrubal killed by the Romans, exclaimed, "Now I recognize the fate of Carthage." Jesus could recognize his own fate in the death of his precursor. He had no doubt of this ever since his vision at Engaddi, had begun his work knowing the inevitable end, and yet this news, when brought by the sorrow-stricken disciples of the prophet of the wilderness, struck Jesus as a death warning. He exclaimed, "They did not recognize him, but have done with him as they wished. Thus shall the Son of Man suffer at their hands." The 12 were troubled and anxious. Jesus was hesitating on his pathway. He did not wish to let himself be taken, but rather, once his work finished, to to offer himself of his own free will and die as a prophet at the hour he himself should choose. Already hunted down during the whole of the past year, accustomed to escape from the enemy by making marches and countermarches, disheartened with the people, whose apathy after days of enthusiasm he was keenly conscious of, Jesus determined once more to escape with his disciples. Reaching the summit of a mountain, he turned around to cast one final lingering look on his beloved lake, on whose banks he had wished the dawn of the kingdom of heaven to shine. His eyes wandered over those towns lying by the waterside, or rising tier upon tier along the mountainside, half buried in their verdant oases, and now glittering with white beneath the golden veil of twilight. Those beloved towns in which he had sown the words of life, and which now abandoned him. A presentiment of the future came over him. With prophetic vision he saw this splendid country changed into a wilderness beneath the vengeful hand of Ishmael, and those words devoid of anger, though full of sorrow and bitterness, fell from his lips. Woe unto thee, Capernaum! Woe unto thee, Chorazin! Woe unto thee, Bethsaida! Then turning towards the heathen world, accompanied by his disciples, he took the path leading along the Jordan Valley from Gadara to Caesarea Philippi. Sad and long was the route of the fugitive band across the mighty plain of reeds and the marshes of the upper Jordan under the burning Syrian sun. The nights were passed beneath the tents of shepherds, or with such a scenes as were living in the small hamlets of this abandoned country. The anxious disciples proceeded with downcast eyes. The Master, filled with sorrow, remained plunged in silent meditation. He was reflecting on the impossibility of the triumph of his doctrine by preaching to the people, and on the unremitting plottings of his enemies. The final struggle was becoming imminent. He had reached a terrible difficulty. How was he to escape? On the other hand, his thoughts dwelt with anxiety on his spiritual family now scattered abroad, and especially on the 12 apostles who, in faith and trust, had left everything, family, profession, and fortune, to follow him, and who, in spite of all, would soon be heartbroken and deceived in their mighty hope of a triumphant Messiah. Could he leave them to themselves? Had the truth sufficiently penetrated their souls? Would they believe in him and in his doctrine, at all events? Did they know who he was? Dominated by this thought, he one day asked them, "Whom say men that I, the Son of Man, am?" They replied, "Some say that thou art John the Baptist, some Elias, and other Jeremias, or one of the prophets." Then Jesus said unto them, "But whom say ye that I am?" Simon Peter answered and said, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." In the mouth of Peter and the thought of Jesus, these words have not the signification the Church at a later date wished to give them. Thou art the elect of Israel, announced by the prophets. In the Hindu, the Egyptian, the Greek initiation, the term Son of God signified a consciousness identified with divine truth, a will capable of manifesting it. According to the prophets, this Messiah must be the greatest of these manifestations. He would be the Son of Man, i.e., the elect of earthly humanity, the Son of God, i.e., the envoy of heavenly humanity, and as such, having in himself the Father or Spirit who, by humanity, reigns over the universe. At this affirmation of the faith of the apostles, Jesus felt an immense joy. So his disciples had understood him. He would live in them, and the bond between heaven and earth would be re-established. Jesus said to Peter, "Happy art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood hath not revealed it unto thee, but my Father which is in heaven." By this reply, Jesus gives Peter to understand that he considers him as an initiate, as he himself was, and also possessed of a deep insight into the truth. This is the true, the only revelation. This is the stone on which the Christ wishes to build his church, and against which the gates of hell shall not prevail. Jesus relies on the Apostle Peter only insofar as he shall have this intuition. A moment later, the Apostle reverting to the ordinary, fear-stricken Peter, the Master treats him in quite a different fashion. Jesus had announced to his disciples that he was about to be put to death at Jerusalem, and Peter protested the words, "Be it far from thee, Lord, this shall not be unto thee." But Jesus, as though seeing a temptation of the flesh in this impulse of sympathy, attempting to shake his mighty resolution, turned sharply round to the apostle and said, "Get thee behind me, Satan, thou art an offense unto me, for thou savorest not the things that be of God, but those that be of men." And the Master's imperious gesture seemed to say, "Forward through the desert." Intimidated by his solemn voice and stern look, the apostles bowed their heads in silence and resumed their journey over the stone hills of the Galanatide. This flight by which Jesus brought his disciples out of Israel resembled a march towards the problem of his messianic destiny, the key to which he was seeking. They reached the gates of Caesarea, that town which had become pagan since the time of Antiochus the Great, was sheltered within a verdant oasis near the Jordan's source at the foot of Hermon's snowy peaks. It had its amphitheater and was resplendent with costly palaces and Grecian temples. Jesus crossed it and continued to the spot at which the Jordan in a clear bubbling stream issues from a mountain cavern, like the stream of life springing from the profound bosom of nature. There was erected a small temple dedicated to Pan, and in the grotto on the banks of the stream, numerous columns, marble nymphs, and pagan divinities. The Jews held in horror these tokens of idolatrous worship. Jesus contemplated them with an indulgent smile. In them he recognized the imperfect effigies of the divine beauty whose radiant models he bore within his own soul. He had not come to utter maledictions against paganism, but to transform it, not to scatter anathema on earth and its mysterious powers, but to point out to it the way to heaven. His heart was large enough and his doctrine sufficiently vast to embrace all people and to say to men of every religion, "Raise your heads and learn that you all have one same Father." And yet there he was at the extreme limit of Israel, hunted like a wild beast, stifled between two peoples who rejected him alike. In front, the heathens, who did not yet understand him and on whom his words fell powerless. Behind, the Jews, a people which stoned his prophets and stopped its ears so as not to hear its Messiah, while all the time the Pharisees and Sadducees were watching their prey. What superhuman courage, what unprecedented power of action would be needed to crush all these obstacles, to penetrate beyond heathen idolatry and Jewish harshness, right to the heart of that suffering humanity he loved with every fiber of his being, and induce it to listen to his resurrection message. Then suddenly his mind went back to bygone times, descending once again the stream of the Jordan, Israel's sacred river, passing from the temple of Pan to that of Jerusalem, measuring the distance which separated ancient paganism from the universal prophetic thought, and regaining its source, as an eagle its nest, returned from the anguish of Caesarea to the vision of Engaddi. And now, from the depths of the Dead Sea, he sees this terrible phantom of the cross once more spring forth. Had the hour of the great sacrifice at length come? Jesus, like all men, possessed two consciousnesses. The earthly one lulled him with illusions, saying, "Who knows? Perhaps I shall escape this destiny." The other, the divine one, repeated implacably, "The path of victory passes through the gate of anguish." Must he choose this latter voice? At all important epochs in his life, we see Jesus withdraw to the mountain to pray. Had not the Vedic sage said, "Prayer upholds heaven and rules the gods"? Jesus knew this greatest of all forces. Usually he admitted of no companion in this mountain solitude when he descended into the inmost elements of his being. This time, however, he took with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, James and John, to spend the night on the summit of a lofty mountain. Legend states this to have been Mount Tabor. There, between the Master and three of the greatest initiates among the disciples, the mysterious scene, related in the Gospels under the name of the Transfiguration, took place. According to Matthew, the apostles saw the Master's form, luminous and apparently diaphanous, appear in the transparent penumbra of the eastern night. His face shone like the sun, and his garments became brilliant as the light. At his side appeared 2 figures, which they took for those of Moses and Elijah. As trembling, they emerged from the strange prostration, which seemed to them at once a profounder sleep and a more intense waking state. They saw the Master alone by their side, restoring them to full consciousness by his touch. The transfigured Christ they had contemplated in this dream was never effaced from their memory. But what had Jesus himself seen and passed through during that night which preceded the most decisive act of his prophetic career? A gradual effacing of earthly things beneath the ardor of prayer, a rapturous ascent from sphere to sphere. He seemed by degrees to be returning along the depths of his consciousness into some previous existence, an altogether spiritual and divine one. Far in the distance were suns, worlds, earths, vortices of suffering incarnations. Now he was conscious of one homogeneous atmosphere, one fluid substance, one intelligent light. Within this radiance, legions of celestial beings form a moving vault, a firmament of ethereal bodies, white as snow, whence beam forth gentle flashes of light. On the shining cloud where he was standing, 6 men in priestly robes and a mighty of stature raise aloft, with joined hands, a dazzling chalice. These are 6 messiahs who have already appeared on earth. The 7th is himself, and this cup signifies the sacrifice he must undergo by incarnating himself on earth in his turn. Beneath the cloud is heard the roar of thunder. There yawns a black abyss, the circle of generations, the pit of life and death, the terrestrial hell. The sons of God, with suppliant gesture, raise the cup. The very firmament of heaven is silent as Jesus, in token of assent, extends his arms in the form of a cross as though he wished to embrace the whole universe. Then the sons of God bow down their faces to the earth. A band of female angels with outspread wings and downcast eyes carry off the incandescent chalice towards the vault of light. The Hosanna resounds with ineffably melodious strains throughout the heavens, but he, without even listening to it, plunges into the pit. This is what had taken place long ago among the Essenes, in the bosom of the Father, where the mysterious rites of eternal love are celebrated and the revolutions of the constellation pass, light as waves. This is what he had sworn to accomplish. This is the reason of his birth and the purpose of his past struggles. And now once more this mighty oath bound him down at the end of his task. Terrible oath, dreaded chalice. Still, it must be drained to the dregs. After all this rapturous bliss, he awoke in the depths of the pit, on the brink of martyrdom. No further doubt was possible. The time was at hand. Heaven had spoken, and earth cried aloud for help. Retracing his steps, Jesus once again descended the valley of the Jordan and proceeded by slow stages along the road to Jerusalem. Chapter 6. Final journey to Jerusalem, the promise, the supper, trial of Jesus, death and resurrection. Hosanna to the Son of David. This was the cry which greeted Jesus as he entered by the eastern gate of Jerusalem, along the streets covered with branches of palm trees. They who welcomed him with such enthusiasm were adherents of the Galilean prophet, who had assembled from both without and within the town to greet him with this ovation. They were welcoming him who was to free Israel, who would soon be crowned king. Even the 12 apostles still shared this illusion in spite of all Jesus had said. He alone, the proclaimed Messiah, knew that he was advancing to his death and that only afterwards would even his disciples penetrate the inner sanctuary of his thought. Resolutely was he offering himself of his own free will and fully conscious of the end. Hence his resignation, his sweet serenity, as he passed beneath the colossal porch cut in the gloomy fortress of Jerusalem. The cry resounded beneath the vault and pursued him like the voice of destiny seizing its prey. Hosanna to the Son of David. By this solemn entrance into the city, Jesus publicly declared to the religious authorities of Jerusalem that he took upon himself the role of Messiah with all its consequences. The following morning he appeared in the temple in the Gentiles' court, and advancing toward the cattle dealers and money changers who by usury and the deafening click of money profaned parvis of the holy place, he uttered against them Isaiah's words. It is written, "My house shall be called the house of prayer, but ye have made it a den of thieves." The dealers fled, carrying off their tables and money bags, intimidated by the partisans of the prophet who formed a solid rampart around him, and even more terrified by his imperious gesture and flashing look. The astonished priests marveled at this boldness and manifestation of power. A deputation from the Sanhedrin came demanding an explanation with the words, "By what authority doest thou these things?" To this insidious question, Jesus, as was his wont, replied by a question no less embarrassing for his enemies. Whence was the baptism of John? From heaven or of men? Had the Pharisees replied, "From heaven," Jesus would have said, "Then why did you not believe him?" Had they said, "From men," they would have had to consider the anger of the people who looked upon John the Baptist as a prophet. Accordingly, they replied, "We cannot tell." "Neither tell I you," said Jesus, "by what authority I do these things." Once the blow warded off, however, he assumed the offensive and added, "Verily, I say unto you, the publicans and the harlots go into the kingdom of God before you." Then, in a parable, he compared them to the wicked husbandman who kills his master's son so as to inherit the vineyard, and he called himself the stone which had become the head of the corner, and which should grind into powder whomsoever it should fall upon. These acts and words show that in making this final journey to Israel's capital, Jesus wished to cut off all retreat. His enemies had long been in possession of the two great keys of accusation necessary for his ruin, his threats against the temple and the affirmation that he was the Messiah. These last attacks exasperated his enemies. From that moment his death, determined upon by the authorities, was only a matter of time. Since his entrance into Jerusalem, the most influential members of the Sanhedrin, scribes and Pharisees, reconciled in common hatred against Jesus, had come to an understanding on the death of this seducer of the people. They hesitated only on the matter of seizing him in public, for they dreaded a rising of the people. On different occasions already, officials sent against him had returned, won over by his words, or alarmed at the multitudes of people. Often had the soldiers of the temple seen him disappear from their midst in mysterious fashion. So also had the emperor Domitian, fascinated and instruct with blindness, so to speak, by the image he wished to condemn, seen Apollonius of Tyana disappear before the tribunal and from the midst of his guards. The struggle between Jesus and the priests thus continued from day to day, with increasing hatred on their side and on his, an enthusiastic strength and impetuosity given him by the certainty he felt as to the fatal issue. This was his last assault against the powers of the day. In it he manifested a mighty energy, as well as that masculine force which, like a coat of mail, clothed that sublime tenderness of his, which might be called the eternal feminine of his soul. This formidable combat ended in terrible maledictions against these debasers of religion. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, who shut up the kingdom of heaven against such as wish to enter it. Ye fools and blind, who pay tithes and neglect justice, pity, and fidelity, ye are like unto whited sepulchres, which appear beautiful from without, but are within full of dead men's bones and of all uncleanliness. After having thus branded religious hypocrisy and false sacerdotal authority, what had for centuries held sway, Jesus considered his struggles at an end. He left Jerusalem with his disciples and proceeded to the Mount of Olives. As they ascended, Herod's temple could be seen in all its majesty, with its terraces and vast porticos, its sculpturing of white marble encrusted with jasper and porphyry, and its dazzling roof of gold and silver. The disciples, discouraged and under the presentiment of a catastrophe, drew the Master's attention to the splendor of the building he was leaving forever. Their words were tinged with melancholy and regret, for, to the last, they had hoped to take their seats therein as judges of Israel around the Messiah, the crowned priest-king. Jesus turned facing the temple and said, See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. He was judging the duration of the temple of Jehovah by the mortal worth of those who ruled therein. He meant that fanaticism, intolerance, and hatred were not sufficient arms against the battle axes and battering rams of the Roman Caesar. With the insight of the initiative, which had become more intense throughout that clairvoyance given by the approach of death, he saw the Judaic pride, the policy of their king, the whole Jewish history terminate fatally in this catastrophe. Triumph did not exist there. It was rather in the prophetic thought, the universal religion, that invisible temple which he alone at that hour had full consciousness of. As for the ancient citadel of Zion and the temple of stone, he already saw the angel of destruction standing sword in hand at its doors. Jesus knew that his hour was nigh, but he did not wish to fall into the hands of the Sanhedrim, so he withdrew to Bethany. As he had a predilection for the Mount of Olives, he came there almost daily to converse with his disciples. From the summit the view was magnificent. The range of vision embraces the rugged mountains of Judea and Moab, with their purplish blue tints, whilst away in the distance could be caught a glimpse of the Dead Sea, like a leaden-hued mirror from whose surface rise dense sulphurous mists. At the foot of the mountain stretched Jerusalem, the temple, and the citadel of Zion towering above all other edifices. Even in these days, as twilight descends on the dark, mysterious gorges of Hinnom and Jehoshaphat, the city of David and of the Christ, protected by the sons of Ishmael, rises in imposing majesty above these gloomy valleys. Its cupolas and minarets reflect the fading light of the heavens and seem to be ever awaiting the angels of judgment. It was there Jesus gave the disciples his final instructions regarding the future of the religion he had come to found and the destiny of mankind, thus bequeathing them his promise, at once terrestrial and divine, intimately wedded with his esoteric teaching. Evidently, the writers of the Synoptic Gospels have handed down to us the apocalyptic sayings of Jesus amid the confusion which renders them almost impenetrable. Their meaning only begins to become intelligible in John's Gospel. If Jesus had really believed in his return on the clouds some years after his death, as is admitted according to the naturalistic interpretation, or if he had imagined that the end of the world and the last judgment of men would take place in this manner, as Orthodox theology believes, he would have a very ordinary visionary indeed, instead of the sage initiate, the sublime seer. Every word of his teaching and every action of his life proclaim him to have been. It is evident that here, especially in his words, must be understood in their allegorical signification according to the transcendent symbolism of the prophets. John's Gospel, the one which has most fully handed down to us the Master's esoteric teaching, forces this interpretation so perfectly in accord as it is with the parabolic genius of Jesus when he relates the Master's words, I have yet many things to say unto you, but ye cannot bear them now. These things I have spoken unto you in parables, but the time cometh when I shall no more speak unto you in parables, but I shall show you plainly of the Father. The solemn promise of Jesus to the apostles embraces 4 objects, 4 increasing spheres of planetary and cosmic life: the individual psychic life, the national life of Israel, the earthly evolution, and the end of humanity as well as the divine. Let us take one by one of these 4 spheres through which radiates the thought of the Christ before his martyrdom, like the setting sun, filling with its glory the whole terrestrial atmosphere right to the zenith before shining on other worlds. 1. The first judgment signifies the ultimate destiny of the soul after death. This is determined by its own inner nature and the acts of its life. I have already expounded this doctrine with reference to Jesus' conversation with Nicodemus. On the Mount of Olives, he says to his disciples, Take heed to yourselves, lest at any time your hearts be overcharged with surfeiting and drunkenness and cares of this life, and so that day come upon you unawares. And again, Be ye also ready, for in such an hour as ye think not, the Son of Man cometh. Number 2, the destruction of the temple and the end of Israel. Nation shall rise against nation. They shall deliver you up to be afflicted. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. Number 3, the terrestrial aim of humanity, which is not fixed at some definite epoch, but must be reached by a graduated series of successive realizations. This aim is the coming of the social Christ, or the divine man on earth, i.e., the organization of truth, justice, and love in human society, and consequently, the pacification of the nations. Isaiah had already foretold this distant epoch in a splendid vision, beginning with the words, For I know their works and their thoughts. It shall come that I will gather all nations and tongues, and they shall come and see my glory, and I will set a sign among them. Jesus, completing this prophecy, explains to his disciples what this sign shall be, the complete unveiling of the mysteries, or the coming of the Holy Ghost, whom he also calls the Comforter, or the Spirit of truth, which shall lead you into all truth. The apostles shall have this revelation beforehand, the mass of humanity in the course of time. But whenever it takes place in an individual consciousness or among a group of men, it pierces through and through. For as the lightning cometh out of the east and shineth even unto the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Thus, when the central and spiritual truth is kindled, it illumines all other truths throughout creation. Number 4. The Last Judgment signifies the end of the cosmic evolution of humanity, or its entrance into a definitely spiritual state. This is what Persian esotericism had called the victory of Ormuzd over the Aramanes, or of spirit over matter. Hindu esotericism named it the complete reabsorption of matter by spirit, or the end of a day of Brahma. After thousands of centuries, a period must come when, through a series of births and rebirths, incarnations and regenerations, the individuals composing a humanity shall have definitely entered the spiritual state or been annihilated as conscious souls by evil, i.e., by their own passions, symbolized by the fire of Gehenna and gnashing of teeth. Then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. They shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds. He shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds. The Son of Man, a generic term here, signifies humanity in its perfect representation, i.e., the small number of those who have raised themselves to the rank of sons of God. His sign is the Lamb and the cross, i.e., love and eternal life. The cloud is the image of the mysteries which have become translucid, as well as of the subtle matter transfigured by the Spirit, of the fluidic substance which is no longer a dense, obscure veil, but a light, transparent garment of the soul, no longer a gross obstacle, but an expression of the truth, no longer a deceptive appearance, but spiritual truth itself, the inner world instantaneously and directly manifested. The angels who gather together, the elect, are glorified spirits who have themselves sprung from humanity. The trumpet they sound symbolizes the living word of spirit, which lays bare the real nature of the soul and destroys all lying appearances of matter. Jesus, feeling his end near, thus explained to his astonished disciples the lofty perspectives which from bygone times had formed part of the doctrine of the mysteries, but to which each religious co-founder has always given personal form and color. To engrave these truths on their mind and facilitate their propagation, he summed them up in such images as were characterized by extreme boldness and incisive energy. The revealing image and speaking symbol formed the universal language of the ancient initiates. Such a language possesses a communicative virtue, a power of concentration, and duration lacking in the abstract term. In using it, Jesus merely followed the example of Moses and the prophets. He knew the idea would not immediately be understood, but he wished to impress it in letters of flame in the simple souls of his followers, leaving to succeeding ages the task of generating the powers contained in his word. Jesus feels himself one with all the prophets of the earth who had gone before, as he had done, messengers of life and of the eternal Word. In this sentiment of unity and solidarity with immutable truth, he dared address to his afflicted disciples the proud words, "Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word shall not pass away." These mornings and evenings on the Mount of Olives flew swiftly by, one day obedient to an impulse peculiar to his ardent and impressionable nature, which caused him suddenly to descend from the most sublime heights to the sufferings of earth, which he felt as his own. He shed tears over Jerusalem, the holy city, and its inhabitants, whose frightful destiny he foresaw. His own was also approaching with giant strides. The Sanhedrim had already discussed his fate and decided on his death. Judas Iscariot had already promised to deliver his master into their hands. It was not sordid avarice, but rather ambition and wounded pride which occasioned this black treachery. Judas, a type of cold egoism and absolute positivism, incapable of the faintest idealism, had become a disciple of the Christ merely from a spirit of worldly speculation. He was relying on the earthly and immediate triumph of the prophet and on his own consequent gain. The Master's profound words, "He who wishes to save his life shall lose it, and he who is willing to lose it shall save it," had no meaning for him. Jesus, in his boundless charity, had received him as one of his disciples in the hope of changing his nature. When Judas saw that matters were not proceeding as he wished, that Jesus and his disciples were compromised, and himself deceived in his hopes, his deception became converted into a feeling of rage. The wretched denounced the man, who, in his eyes, was only a false Messiah who had deceived him. The penetrating insight of Jesus told him what was taking place in the mind of the faithless apostle. He now determined he would no longer avoid the destiny whose inextricable folds were daily tightening around him. It was the eve of Easter, so he ordered his disciples to prepare the meal at a friend's house in the town. He foresaw it would be his last repast, and accordingly wished to give it an exceptional solemnity. Now we enter upon the final act of the Messianic drama. In order to thoroughly understand the spirit and work of Jesus, it has been necessary to shed an inner light on the first two acts of his life, his initiation and public career. Subsequently, the inner drama of his consciousness has been unfolded. The final act of his life, or the drama of the Passion, is the logical consequence of the two preceding. Since it is known to all, it explains itself, for the peculiarity of the sublime is that it is at once simple, grandiose, and clear. The drama of the Passion has powerfully contributed to the institution of Christianity. It has drawn tears from every human being possessed of a heart and converted millions of souls. Throughout all of these scenes, the Gospels are of incomparable beauty. Even John descends from his lofty heights, and his circumstantiated account assumes a character of poignant truth, such as an eyewitness alone could give. Every one may live again in himself the divine drama. No one could recreate it. And yet, in ending my task, I must concentrate the rays of esoteric tradition on the three essential events by which the life of the Divine Master came to an end: the Holy Supper, the trial of the Messiah, and the resurrection. If light is thrown on these points, it will be reflected backwards on the whole career of the Christ and forwards on the succeeding history of Christianity. The 12, forming 13 with the Master, had met in the upper room of a house in Jerusalem. The unknown friend, Jesus' host, had covered the floor with a rich carpet. In Oriental fashion, the Master and his disciples reclined on 4 large divans in the form of a triclinia arranged around the table. When the Paschal lamb and the golden chalice lent by the friend had been brought into the room and the vases filled with wine, Jesus seated between John and Peter and said, "With desire I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I say unto you, I will not any more eat thereof until it be fulfilled in the kingdom of God." Thereupon the countenances became overshadowed. Silence filled the air. The disciple whom Jesus loved, who alone divined everything, bowed his head on the Master's breast. As was usual among the Jews at the Easter meal, not a word was uttered as they ate the bitter herbs and charoset placed before them. Finally, Jesus took bread, and after giving thanks, he brake it and distributed unto them, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. This do in remembrance of me." He also took the cup, saying, "This cup is the New Testament in my blood, which is shed for you." Such is the institution of the supper in all its simplicity. It has a far wider signification than is generally granted or known, for not only is the mystical and symbolic act the conclusion and resume of the entire teaching of the Christ, it is the consecration and rejuvenation of a very ancient symbol of initiation. Among the initiates of Egypt and Chaldea, as among the prophets and Essenes, the fraternal agape marked the first stage of initiation. The communion under the element of bread, the fruit of the sheaf, signified knowledge of the mysteries of earthly life, as well as a sharing of terrestrial blessings, and consequently the perfect union of affiliated brothers. In the higher degree, communion under the element of wine, the blood of the vine, penetrated through and through by the Son, signified the sharing of heavenly blessings, participation in spiritual mysteries, and divine science. Jesus, in bequeathing these symbols to the apostles, enlarged their meaning. Through them, he extends to the whole of mankind fraternity and initiation, formerly limited to the few. To them he adds the profoundest of mysteries, the greatest of forces, that of his own sacrifice. This he converts into the invisible, but infrangible change of love between himself and his followers. It will give his glorified soul a divine power over their hearts as well as over the hearts of all men. This cup of truth which had come from distant prophetic ages, this golden chalice of initiation which the old Essene had offered him in addressing him as a prophet, this chalice of celestial love the sons of God had offered him in the ecstasy of his loftiest rapture, this cup in which he now sees his own blood reflected, he now gives over to his well-beloved disciples with the ineffable tenderness of a last farewell. Do the apostles see and understand this redeeming, world-embracing thought? It shines in the Master's profound, though sorrowful glance as he turns from the disciple he loved to the one about to betray him. No, they do not yet understand. They seem to breathe with difficulty, as though under the power of some frightful dream. A kind of heavy, ruddy vapor floats in the air, and they wonder as to the source of that strange radiance about the Christ head. When, finally, Jesus tells them that he is about to spend the night in prayer on the Mount of Olives, and as he rises, requests them to follow him, they no longer doubt as to what is about to happen. The night is past, the anguish of Gethsemane at an end. With terrifying clearness, he has seen the infernal circle about to destroy him grow less and less. In the horror of the situation and the dreadful momentary expectation of being seized by his enemies, a shudder passed through his frame. For a moment his soul shrank before the tortures that awaited him. Drops of bloody sweat stood on his brow. Then prayer came to his aid. Confused cries, torches, flashing beneath the gloomy olive trees, the clash of arms, were so many signs testifying to the approach of a band of soldiers sent by the Sanhedrim. Judas, at their head, kisses his master so that they may recognize the prophet. Jesus returns the kiss with a look of ineffable compassion and says to him, "Friend, wherefore art thou come?" The effect of this gentleness, this brotherly kiss given in exchange for the basest of treason, will be such on the heart, notwithstanding its hardness, that a moment later, Judas, overcome with horror and remorse, will take his own life. And now, with rude, cruel hands, the soldiers have seized the Galilean rabbi. After a brief resistance, the terrified disciples have fled. Peter and John alone remain at hand and follow the Master to the tribunal. Their hearts are well nigh broken as they anxiously await his fate. Jesus has now regained control over himself. From that moment, not a single protest or complaint will break from his lips. The entire Sanhedrim is hastily assembled, and Jesus is brought into their presence at midnight, for the court is determined to deal promptly with the dangerous prophet. Priests and sacrificers, turbans on their heads and wearing purple, yellow, and violet tunics, are solemnly seated in a semicircle. In their midst sits Caiaphas, the chief priest, wearing on his head the migbah. At each end of the ark, on 2 small tribunes, sit the clerks, one for acquittal and the other for condemnation. Advocatus Dei, Advocatus Diaboli. Jesus, in his white Essenian robe, stands impressive in the center. Officers of justice, armed with ropes and thongs, men with bared arms and evil-looking eyes, stand around. Witnesses for the accusation alone are present. There is not one for the defense. The high priest, the supreme magistrate, is the principal accuser. The trial, apparently a measure of public safety against a crime or religious treason, is in reality the preventive vengeance of an anxious priesthood which feels its power in danger. Caiaphas rises and accuses Jesus of being a seducer of the people, a messit. A few witnesses taken at hazard from the crowd give their depositions, but only succeed in contradicting one another. Finally, one of them reports the words of Jesus, "I can destroy the temple and build it again in 3 days," words which had been considered blasphemous and which the Nazarene had more than once flung in the face of the Pharisees under Solomon's porch. Jesus holds his peace. "Answerest thou nothing?" asks the high priest. Jesus, who knows he will be condemned and is unwilling to lavish words to no purpose, still makes no reply. These words, however, even if proved, would not form sufficient motive for a death penalty. A graver avowal is needed. To force one, Caiaphas, the cunning Sadducee, addresses him a question involving his honor, the vital question of his mission. The greatest skill often consists in going straight to the root of a matter. "If thou art the Messiah, say so now." Jesus at first replies evasively, thus proving that he is not their dupe. "If I say it, you will not believe me. But if I ask you the same question, you will give me no answer." As Caiaphas does not succeed in his artifice, he uses his authority as high priest and solemnly says, "I adjure thee by the living God, that thou tell us whether thou be the Christ, the Son of God." Thus called upon either to retract or affirm his mission before the highest representative of the religion of Israel, Jesus no longer hesitates. He replies calmly, "Thou hast said. Nevertheless, I say unto you, hereafter shall ye see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven." Thus expressing himself in the prophetic language of Daniel and the book of Enoch, Jehoshua, the Essene initiate, does not address Caiaphas as an individual. He knows that the Sadducee agnostic is incapable of understanding him and accordingly speaks to the sovereign priest of Jehovah and through him to all future priests and priesthoods of the earth, saying to them, "After my mission, sealed by my death, the reign of unexplained religious law is at an end, both in principle and in deed. The mystery shall be revealed, and man shall see the divine through the human. Religions and acts of worship which cannot be demonstrated and vivified by one another shall be void of authority." This, according to the esotericism of the prophets and Essenes, is the meaning of the Son sitting on the right hand of the Father. Thus understood, Jesus' reply to the high priest of Jerusalem contains the intellectual and scientific testament of the Christ to the religious authorities of the earth, just as the institution of the supper contains his testament of love and initiation to the apostles and to mankind in general. In addressing Caiaphas, Jesus spoke to the whole world. The Sadducee, however, who had obtained what he wished, listens to nothing more. Tearing his vestment of fine linen, he exclaims, "He has blasphemed. What further need have we of witnesses? Ye have heard this blasphemy. What think ye of it?" A gloomy though ominous murmur arose from the Sanhedrin. "He is guilty of death." Immediately, vile insults and brutal outrage on the part of those of lower rank gave answer to the condemnation uttered by their superiors. The guards spit on him and strike him in the face as they exclaim, "Prophesy unto us, thou Christ, who is he that smote thee?" Beneath this outburst of low and savage hatred, the pale, sublime countenance of the great sufferer resumes its visionary marble fixity. Someone has said, there are statues which weep. There is indeed a tearless grief, victims' unuttered prayers, full of the terror to the assailants whom they pursue for the remainder of their lives. All was not yet over, however. The Sanhedrim may pronounce the death penalty. The secular power and the consent of the Roman authorities are needed to put it into execution. The interview with Pilate, related in detail by John, is no less remarkable than that with Caiaphas. This strange dialogue between the Christ and the Roman governor, to which the violence of the Jewish priests and the cries of a fanatical populace play the part of an ancient tragedy chorus, gives the conviction of a mighty dramatic truth, for it lays bare the souls of the different characters and shows the clash of the three powers in play: Roman Caesarism, bigoted Judaism, and the universal religion of the Spirit represented by the Christ. Pilate, totally indifferent to the religious quarrel, but greatly troubled over the matter, for he is afraid the death of Jesus will occasion a rising of the people, questions him with a certain amount of precaution, and offers him a means of escape in the hope that he will take advantage of it. "Art thou the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world." Pilate asked, "Then thou art a king?" Jesus again replied, "To this end I was born, and for this cause I came into the world, that I should bear witness unto the truth." Pilate no more understands this affirmation of the spiritual royalty of Jesus than Caiaphas understood his religious testament. "What is truth?" he remarks with a shrug of the shoulders. The skeptical Roman knight's question reveals the state of mind in which the heathen world then was, as it does that of all society in a state of decadence. All the same as he did not see the accused Jesus anything other than a harmless dreamer, he added, "I find no fault in him," and proposes to the Jews that he should liberate him. The populace, however, instigated by the priests, cries aloud, "Release unto us Barabbas." Then Pilate, who detests the Jews, gives himself the ironical pleasure of causing their pretended king to be beaten with rods. He thinks this will satisfy the fanatics, but they only become more furious and madly exclaim, "Crucify him." In spite of this outburst of popular passion, Pilate still resists. He is tired of being cruel. Throughout his life he has seen so much bloodshed, punished with death so many rebels, and heard so many groans and curses without his equanimity being troubled in the slightest. But the mute stoic suffering of the Galilean prophet beneath the purple cloak and crown of thorns has sent a hitherto unknown thrill through his very being. In a strange, fugitive vision, he utters the words with no idea of their import. "Exi homo," behold the man. The stern, hard-hearted Roman is almost overcome with emotion. He is on the point of pronouncing a sentence of acquittal. The priests of the Sanhedrim, with eyes intently fixed on him, see this emotion and are filled with terror in consequence. They feel that their prey is escaping them. Craftily, they deliberate among themselves. After a few moments, they raise their right hands and, turning aside their heads with horrified gesture, exclaim in one voice, "He has made himself the Son of God." When Pilate heard that saying, says John, his fear increased. Fear of what? What meaning had this for the unbelieving Roman who heartily despised both the Jews and their religion and believed in none other than Caesar and the political religion of Rome? There's a serious reason for this. Although different meanings were given to it, the expression Son of God was tolerably well known in ancient esotericism, and Pilate, although skeptical, was not altogether free from superstition. At Rome, in the minor mysteries of Mithras, in which Roman knights became initiated, he had heard that a son of God was a kind of interpreter of divinity. To whatever nation or religion he belonged, an attempt on his life was a great crime. Pilate had little faith in these Persian reveries, but the name troubled him, nevertheless, and increased his embarrassment. Seeing this, the Jews fling at the proconsul the final accusation. "If thou settest free this man, thou art no friend of Caesar's. Whosoever maketh himself a king speaketh against Caesar. We have no king but Caesar. irresistible argument, denying God is of little import, but conspiring against Caesar is the crime of crimes. Pilate is obliged to give way and pronounce sentence of condemnation. Thus, at the end of his public career, Jesus finds himself face to face with the master of the world, against whom he, an occult opponent, has fought indirectly all his life. The shadow of Caesar sends him to the cross. Profound is the logic of events. The Jews have delivered him up to judgment, but it is the Roman specter which stretches out its hand to kill. The body indeed is destroyed, but it is he, the glorified Christ, whose martyrdom will forever deprive Caesar of the aureole he has usurped, the divine apotheosis, the infernal blasphemy of absolute power. Pilate, after washing his hands of the blood of the innocent Jesus, now utters the terrible words, "Condemno ibis in crucem," and the impatient mob hurries away in the direction of Golgotha. Following them, we find ourselves in the barren heights overlooking Jerusalem and bearing the name of Gilgal Golgotha, or Place of Skulls. A sinister desert covered with human bones for centuries, the scene of horrible punishments. Not a tree can be seen. The ground seems to bristle with gibbets. It is here that Alexander Janneus had come with his whole harem to witness the execution of hundreds of prisoners. Here that Varus had crucified 2,000 rebels, and now the gentle Messiah, whose coming had been foretold by the prophets, was on this same spot to undergo the terrible death penalty invented by the atrocious genius of the Phoenicians and adopted by the implacable law of Rome. The cohort of the legionnaires has formed a mighty circle on top of the hill. They drive away with their lances the few followers who remained faithful to the condemned Christ. These are Galilean women, mute with despair, who fling themselves on the ground before the cross. The final hour has come. The defender of the poor, the feeble, and the oppressed must finish his task in that state of abject martyrdom reserved for slaves and robbers. The prophet consecrated by the Essenes must allow himself to be nailed to the cross he had accepted in the vision of Engaddi. The Son of God must drink the chalice which had appeared to him in the Transfiguration and must descend into the depths of hell and of all earthly horror. He has refused the traditional drink prepared by the pious women of Jerusalem, and which is intended to deaden the sufferings of the crucified victims. In the fullest consciousness will he suffer the agony of death, bound to the cruel gibbet as the stern, hard-hearted soldiers with mighty hammer blows drive the nails into those feet, the object of such passionate reverence, and through those hands, never raised except in blessing, a dull mist of horrible pain closes his eyes and chokes his throat. Still, amid such convulsions of pain and infernal anguish, the Savior pleads for his executioners. "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Now the cup is being drained to its dregs. The death agony lasts from noon to sunset. Moral is added to the physical torture, which it surpasses in malignity. The initiate has abdicated his powers. The Son of God is about to suffer eclipse. Only the man of sorrows remains. For a few hours he will lose his heaven to measure and fathom the depths of the abyss of human suffering. There stands the cross with its victim and the superscription, the preconsul's final shaft of irony. This is the King of the Jews. As through a mist of anguish, the crucified one sees the holy city Jerusalem he wished to glorify, now hurling anathemas against him. Where are his disciples? They have disappeared in all directions. He hears nothing but the insults of the members of the Sanhedrin, who, imagining that the prophet is no longer to be feared, exult with joy at his death struggles. He saved others, they say. Himself he cannot save. Through such perverse blasphemies, Jesus sees, in terrifying prophetic vision, all the crimes that unjust potentates and fanatical priests are to commit in his name. With his own sign will they pronounce maledictions, and with his own cross will they crucify. It is not the gloomy silence of the heavens veiled against him, but rather the light, lost to humanity, which tears from him the despairing wail. "Father, why hast thou forsaken me?" Then, in one final burst, there springs forth from his soul the cry, "It is finished." Sublime Nazarene, divine Son of Man, even now is the victory thine. Doubtless thy soul has once again found in light more dazzling than before the heaven of Engaddi and Mount Tabor. Down through the ages hast thou seen thy word fleeting victorious, and no other glory hast thou desired than the uplifted hands and eyes of those thou hast healed and comforted. Even now a shudder of dread comes over thy torturers as they listen to thy final words so full of meaning, but which they do not understand. The Roman soldiers have turned their gaze at the strange radiance thy spirit has left on the tranquil countenance of this corpse, while thy slayers look at one another in wonder and say, "Could this have been God?" Is the drama really finished? The silent though formidable strife now at the end, the struggle between divine love and death, which has united with the reigning powers of earth to overwhelm him, at last closed? Where is the victor? Does triumph remain with those self-satisfied priests as they descend from cavalry, well pleased with their deed, for they have seen the prophet breathe his last, or with this pale crucified Christ, already livid in death? For these faithful weeping women, whom the Roman legionaries have permitted to approach the foot of the cross, as well as for the terror-stricken disciples who have taken refuge in the grotto of Jehoshaphat, all is indeed at an end. The Messiah, who was to be enthroned at Jerusalem, has died an infamous death on the cross. The Master has disappeared, and with him hope, the gospel, the kingdom of heaven itself. A gloomy silence of deep despair hangs over the small community. Even Peter and John are overwhelmed with grief. Darkness is all around. Not a single ray illumines their souls. And yet, just as in the Eleusinian mysteries, profound darkness is followed by a dazzling light, so, in the Gospels, this deep despair is succeeded by a sudden miraculous joy which bursts forth like a beam of light at sunrise, and the joyful cry resounds throughout Judea, "He is risen again." Mary Magdalene, wandering near the tomb in excess of her grief, was the first to see the Master and to recognize him by his voice as he uttered her name, "Mary." Overcome with joy, she threw herself at his feet. Again she saw Jesus look at her and wave his hand as though to prevent her touching him. Then the apparition suddenly vanished, leaving around the Magdalene an atmosphere of warmth and delight, of a real presence. Afterwards the holy women met the Lord, who said to them, "Go and tell my brethren to proceed to Galilee. There they shall see me." That same evening, as the 11 were met in private, they saw Jesus enter the room. He took a seat in their midst and gently reproached them for their unbelief. Then he said, "Go ye all into the world and preach the gospel to every creature." They listened to him as in a dream, for they seemed to have completely forgotten his death and were persuaded that the Master would not again leave them. However, just as they were about to speak, they saw him disappear from their midst like a vanishing light. The echo of his voice still vibrated in their ears. The apostles, amazed, sought the spot where he had been. There still lingered a vague light, which quickly disappeared. According to Matthew and Mark, Jesus appeared once more on a mountain to 500 of the brethren assembled by the apostles. He also showed himself again to the 11, after which the apparitions ceased. Faith, however, had been created, the first-time impulse given, and Christianity was a living force. The apostles, filled with the sacred fire, went about healing the sick and preaching their Master's gospel. 3 years afterwards, a young Pharisee named Saul, animated by violent hatred against the new religion, whose defenders he persecuted with all the vigor of youth, journeyed to Damascus, accompanied by several companions. On the way he saw himself suddenly enveloped in so dazzling a flame of fire that he fell to the earth. Trembling, he exclaimed, "Who art thou?" A voice replied, "I am Jesus, whom thou persecutest. It is hard for thee to kick against the pricks." Saul's terrified companions raised him to his feet. They had heard the voice, though they had seen nothing. The young man, blinded by the flash, recovered his sight only 3 days afterwards. Converted to the faith of Christ, he became Paul, the apostle of the Gentiles. On this one point is the whole world agreed, that but for Saul's conversion, Christianity, confined as it was to Judea, would never have conquered the Western world. Such are the facts as related in the New Testament. Whatever efforts be made to reduce their results to a minimum, and whatever be the religious or philosophical idea attached to them, they cannot be regarded as legends, pure and simple, and refuse the value for authentic testimony on all points essential. For 18 centuries, the waves of doubt and denial have assailed the rock of this testimony. For 100 years, the weapons of criticism have been directed against it. Breaches have been effected in places, but its position remains steadfast. What is there behind the visions of the apostles? Elementary theologians, interpreters of the letter, and agnostic savants may dispute forever. They will never convert one another, and their reasonings will be in vain so long as theosophy, the science of the spirit, has not enlarged their conceptions, and a superior experimental psychology, the art of laying bare the soul, left their eyes unopened. But from the standpoint of the conscientious historian, i.e., the authenticity of these facts as physical actualities, there is one point on which doubt is impossible, that the apostles had these apparitions and that it was impossible to shake their faith in the resurrection of Christ. If John's account be rejected on the ground of having received its definite compilation about 100 years after the death of Jesus, and also Luke's account of the Christ appearance to the disciples at Emmaus as a mere poetical amplification, there still remain the simple and positive affirmations of Matthew and Mark, which lie at the very root of the Christian tradition and religion. And even more solid and indisputable is the testimony of Paul, wishing to explain to the Corinthians the reason of his faith and the basis of the gospel he preaches. He enumerates in order 6 successive appearances of Jesus, those to Peter, to the 11, to the 500, most of whom he says are still living, to James, to the assembled apostles, and finally his own vision on the way to Damascus. These facts were communicated to Paul by Peter himself and by James 3 years after the death of Jesus, just after Paul's conversion at the time of his first journey to Jerusalem. Accordingly, he received them from eyewitnesses. Finally, the most indisputable of all these visions is by no means the least extraordinary. I refer to that of Paul himself. He continually alludes to it in his epistles as being the source of his faith. Given the former psychological condition of Paul and the nature of his vision, we see it is from without, not from within. Of an unexpected and terrifying character, it completely changes his whole being. Like a baptism of fire, it descends upon him, clothes him in a new and impenetrable armor, and establishes him in the sight of the whole world as the invincible champion of the Christ. Paul's testimony accordingly possesses a double authority insofar as it confirms his own vision and corroborates those of others. Whoever might feel inclined to doubt the sincerity of such affirmations would be obliged to reject en masse all historical testimony and to renounce the writing of history. Note, too, that if critical history is incompatible with an exact weighing and well-thought-out selection of all the documents, philosophical history would also be impossible if greatness of effects could not be referred back to greatness of causes. It would be impossible with Celsus, Strauss, and M. Renan to refuse all objective value to the resurrection and consider it as a phenomenon of resulting from pure hallucination. If so, one is obliged to found the greatest religious revolution of humanity on an aberration of the senses and a mere delusion of the mind. There can be no denying that faith in the resurrection is the basis of historical Christianity. But for this confirmation of Jesus' teaching by dazzling fact, his religion would not even have had a beginning. This event effected a complete revolution in the souls of the apostles. In consequence of it, their whole mental attitude, from being Judaic, became Christian. The Christ is living in glory. He has spoken to them. The heavens have opened. The life beyond has entered into the life within. The dawn of immortality has touched them and kindled their souls with a fire which nothing can extinguish. Above Israel's tottering earthly kingdom, they have caught a glimpse of the world-wide heavenly kingdom in all its glory. Hence their eagerness for the strife, their joy in martyrdom. Jesus' resurrection gives birth to this mighty impulse and hope which carries the gospel to all nations and the good tidings to the utmost limits of the earth. For the success of Christianity, two things were necessary. As Faber de Olivet has said, that Jesus should be willing to die, and that he should have the power to rise again. To form a rational idea of the fact of the resurrection and understanding its religious philosophical bearing, one must consider only the phenomenon of the successive appearances and, from the very outset, remove from one's mind the absurd idea of the resurrection of the body, one of the greatest stumbling blocks of Christian dogma, which, in this particular, as in many others, has remained at quite a childish, rudimentary stage. The disappearance of Jesus' body can be explained by natural causes, and it is worthy of note that the bodies of several great adepts have disappeared quite as mysteriously and without leaving the slightest trace. It has never been discovered what became of the bodies of Moses, Pythagoras, Apollonius, of Tyana. Possibly the brothers, known or unknown, who kept watch over them, destroyed by fire their master's body to prevent pollution at the hands of enemies. In any case, it is only when regarded from the esoteric point of view that the scientific aspect and spiritual grandeur of the resurrection really appear. By Egyptians as Persians, of the religion of Zoroaster, both before and after Jesus, by Israelites, and by Christians of the 1st and 2nd centuries, the resurrection has been interpreted in two ways, the one material and absurd, the other spiritual and theosophical. The first is a popular idea, finally adopted by the Church after the repression of the Gnosticism. The second is the profound idea of the initiates. According to the first view, the resurrection signifies the return to life of the material body. In a word, the reconstitution of the decomposed or dispersed corpse, so it was imagined, was destined to take place at the coming of the Messiah or at the Last Judgment. It is useless to insist on the gross materialism and absurdity of this conception. To the initiate, the resurrection has a far different meaning. It refers to the doctrine of the ternary constitution of man. It signifies the purification and regeneration of the sidereal, ethereal, and fluidic body, which is the very organism of the soul. This purification may take place commencing from the present life through the inner work of the soul and a certain method of existence, although, for the generality of mankind, it finds accomplishment only after death. And then for those who, in one way or another, have aspired towards justice and truth. In the other world, hypocrisy is impossible. Their souls appear as they are in reality. They fatally manifest themselves under the form and color of their essence, dark and hideous if they are evil, radiant and beautiful if they are good. Such is the doctrine given by Paul in the epistle to the Corinthians, where he formally says, "There is an animal body and there is a spiritual body." Jesus states this symbolically, but with greater profundity for those who can read between the lines in the secret conversation with Nicodemus. Now, the more a soul is spiritualized, the farther will it be from the earthly atmosphere, the farther away the cosmic region which attracts it by the law of affinity, the more difficult its manifestation to men. Accordingly, superior souls seldom manifest themselves to man, except in a state of ecstasy or profound slumber. Then, the physical eyes being closed, the soul, half detached from the body, itself sees souls at times. Nevertheless, it sometimes happens that a mighty prophet, a veritable Son of God, manifests himself to his own in the waking state of consciousness, the better to persuade them by a striking appeal to sense and imagination. In such instances, the discarnated soul succeeds in momentarily giving its spiritual body a visible, sometimes even a tangible appearance by means of the special dynamism exercised by spirit over matter through the intermediary of the electrical forces of the atmosphere and the magnetic forces of living bodies. Apparently, this is what happened in the case of Jesus. The appearances related to the New Testament may be placed in one or the other, alternately, of these two categories, spiritual vision and sense apparition. What is certain is that they possessed for the apostles the character of supreme reality. They would rather have doubted the existence of heaven and earth than their living communion with the resurrected Christ. For these soul-stirring appearances form the brightest events in their lives, the profoundest truth of which they were conscious. There is nothing supernatural in them, though there is an unknown element in nature, its occult continuation into the infinite, the flashes of the invisible on the confines of the visible. In our present corporeal state, we can scarcely believe in or even conceive of the reality of the impalpable. In the spiritual state, it is matter which will appear to us unreal and non-existent. In the spirit is found the synthesis of soul and matter, two phases of the one substance. Reverting to eternal principles and final causes, it is the innate laws of intelligence which explain the dynamism of nature, as it is the study of the soul by experimental psychology which explains the laws of life. Consequently, the resurrection, esoterically understood as I have just pointed out, was at once the necessary conclusion of the life of Jesus and the indispensable preface to the historical evolution of Christianity. Necessary conclusion, for Jesus had on several occasions announced to his disciples the power of appearing to them in triumphant glory after his death was due to the purity and innate force of his soul, increased 100-fold by the grandeur of the effort and of the accomplished work. Regarded from them without and from an earthly point of view, the messianic drama ends on the cross. Though sublime in itself, there is yet lacking the fulfillment of promise. Regarded from within, from the inmost consciousness of the Christ, and from the heavenly point of view, the drama contains 3 acts, whose summits are marked by the temptation, the transfiguration, and the resurrection. These 3 phases represent, in other terms, the initiation of Christ, the total revelation, and the crowning of the work. They correspond to what the apostles and the Christian initiates of the first centuries called the mysteries of the Father, of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. A necessary crowning, as I have said, of the life of Christ, and an indispensable preface to the historical evolution of Christianity. The ship, built on the beach, needed to be launched on the ocean. The resurrection was, in addition, as a flood of light thrown on the whole esoteric life of Jesus. We have no occasion for astonishment at finding that the early Christians were, so to speak, dazzled and blinded by the wonderful event, that they often gave a literal interpretation to the Master's teaching and mistook the meaning of his words. But in these days, now that the human spirit has traversed ages, religions, and sciences, we can divine what a St. Paul, a St. John, what Jesus himself understood by the mysteries of the Father and of the Spirit. We see that they contain the very highest and truest elements of the psychical, science, theosophic intuition of the East. We also see the power of renewed expansion given by the Christ to the ancient eternal truth by the grandeur of his love and energy of his will. Finally, we see the metaphysical and practical side of Christianity, the cause of its power and vitality. The old theosophists of Asia were acquainted with transcendent truths. The Brahmins even found the key to the past and future life by formulating the organic law of reincarnation and the alternation of lives. In entering the life beyond, however, and contemplating eternity, they forgot terrestrial realization, individual and social life. Greece, at first initiated into the same truths under more veiled and anthropomorphic forms, became attached by its very genius to the natural terrestrial life. This enabled it to reveal the immortal laws of beauty and to formulate the principles of sciences of observation. From this point of view, its conception of the life beyond gradually diminished and darkened. Jesus, in his breadth and universality, embraces both sides of life. In the Lord's Prayer, which sums up his teaching, he says, "Thy kingdom come on earth, as is in heaven." Now the kingdom of the divine on earth signifies the fulfillment of the moral and social law in all its richness, in all the glory of the beautiful, the good, and the true. Thus the magic of his doctrine, his, in a sense, unlimited power of development, dwell in the unity of his moral and metaphysical aspects, his ardent faith in life eternal, and the necessity he felt of beginning it in a world by a life of action and love. The Christ says to the soul cast down by earthly trouble, "Rise, heaven is thy fatherland." Still, in order to believe this and to attain thereto, prove it here below by deeds of love. Chapter 7. The Promise and its Fulfillment. The Temple. In 3 days I will destroy the temple, and in 3 days I will build it up again. This was said to his disciples by the Son of Mary, the Essene consecrated as Son of Man, i.e., the spiritual inheritor of the word of Moses, of Hermes, and of all the former sons of God. Has this bold promise, the word of the initiator and of initiate, been realized? Yes, if consideration be taken of the consequences which the teaching of Christ, confirmed by his death and spiritual resurrection, have had for humanity, and all the consequences his promise holds over a limitless future. His word and sacrifice have laid the foundations of an invisible temple, but it is only continued and brought to completion in proportion as each individual throughout all time contributes to the work. What is this temple? It is of a nature at once moral, social, and physical, the temple of regenerate humanity. The moral temple is the regeneration of the human soul, the transformation of individuals by the human ideal offered as an example to humanity in the person of Jesus. The wonderful harmony and plenitude of his virtues make it difficult to define. Balanced reason, mystic intuition, human sympathy, power of word and action, infinite compassion, love, even unto sacrifice, courage unto death, no experience was unknown to him. There was sufficient soul in every drop of his blood to make a hero, and yet, what divine gentleness was his! The profound union of heroism and love, of will and intelligence, of the eternal masculine with the eternal feminine make of him the flower of the human ideal. His whole moral teaching, whose loftiest expression is unending brotherly love and a universal human alliance, flows naturally from such a mighty personality. The work of the 18 centuries which have collapsed since his death has resulted in the inculcating of this ideal in the consciousness of all mankind. For there is scarcely a man throughout the civilized world who does not possess a more or less clear notion thereof. Accordingly, it may be affirmed that the moral temple desired by Christ is, if not finished, at any rate based on an indestructible foundation at the present day. It is not so with the social temple. This supposes the establishment of the kingdom of God or of the providential law in the organic institutions of humanity. It remains to be constructed from the foundation, for men still live in a state of warfare under the law of force and destiny. The law of the Christ, which remains in the moral conscience, has not yet passed into the human institutions. I have only incidentally touched upon questions of social and political organization in this book, which is solely intended to throw light on the philosophical and religious question at its base through some of the essential esoteric truths. In these few concluding words, I will not discuss the question any further. It is too vast and complex, and beyond my power to attempt even to define it within the compass of a few words. I will merely say that social warfare exists as a principle in all European countries. There are no economic, religious, or social principles admitted by all classes of society. The nations of Europe also have not ceased existing in a state of open war or armed peace with one another. They are united by no common federative principle. Their interests and common aspirations appeal to no recognized authority. They have no sanction before any supreme tribunal. If the law of Christ has penetrated into individual consciousness and, up to a certain point, into social life, it is still the pagan and barbarian law which governs our political institutions. At the present time, political power is everywhere constituted on insufficient foundations. On the one hand, it emanates from so-called divine right of kings, which is none other than military force. On the other, from universal suffrage, which is merely the instinct of the masses or mere average intelligence. A nation is not a number of uniform values or ciphers. It is a living being composed of organs. So long as national representation is not the image of this organization, right from its working to its teaching classes, there will be no organic or intelligent national representation. So long as the delegates of all scientific bodies and the whole of the Christian churches do not sit together in one upper council, our societies will be governed by instinct, by passion, and by might, and there will be no social temple. Then how comes it that, rising above the church, which is too small to contain him in his entirety, above politics which deny him, and above science which only half understands him, the Christ is fuller of life than ever? It is because his sublime morality is the corollary of science even more sublime. Behind him we perceive, contemporary with and beyond the time of Moses, the whole ancient theosophy of Indian, Egyptian, and Grecian initiates, of whom he forms a striking confirmation. We are beginning to understand that Jesus, at the very height of his consciousness, the transfigured Christ, is opening his loving arms to his brothers, the other messiahs who preceded him, beams of the living world as he was, that he is opening them wide to science in its entirety, art in its divinity, and life in its completeness. But his promise cannot be fulfilled without the help of all the living forces of humanity. Two main things are necessary nowadays for the continuation of the mighty work. On one hand, the progressive unfolding of experimental science and intuitive philosophy to facts of psychic order, intellectual principles, and spiritual proofs. On the other, the expansion of Christian dogma in the direction of a tradition and esoteric science, and subsequently a reorganization of the Church according to a graduated initiation. This by a free and irresistible movement of all Christian churches, which are also equally daughters of the Christ. Science must become religious and religion scientific. This double evolution, already in preparation, would finally and forcibly bring about a reconciliation of science and religion on esoteric grounds. The work will not progress without considerable difficulty at first, but the future of European society depends on it. The transformation of Christianity in its esoteric sense would bring with it that of Judaism and Islam, as well as a regeneration of Brahmanism and Buddhism. In the same fashion, it would accordingly furnish a religious basis for the reconciliation of Asia and Europe. This is the spiritual temple to be constructed, the crowning of the world intuitively conceived and desired by Jesus. Can his message of love form the magnetic chain of science and art, of religions and peoples, and thus become the universal word? At the present time, the Christ is master of the globe, throughout the two youngest and most vigorous races, still full of faith. By way of Russia, he has a foothold in Asia, and through the Anglo-Saxon race, he rules the New World. Europe is older than America, but younger than Asia. They slander Europe, who believe her destined to an irremediable decadence. Still, if she continues her internal struggles, instead of federating beneath the rule of one capable authority, at once scientific and religious, if, through the extinction of this faith which is only the love-fed light of the Spirit, she is continuing the preparation for her moral and social decomposition, her civilization runs the risk of perishing, first by social upheavals, and afterward by the invasion of younger races, which will seize the torch dropped from her hands. Surely she has a more glorious part to play in the preservation of the guiding of the world by finishing the social work of the Christ, formulating his complete and perfect thought, and crowning, by the help of science, art, and justice, the spiritual temple of the greatest of the sons of God. The End.